Welcome to a recording from Oxford and Cambridge University's travel webinar series, hosted by their tour operator partner for Latin America, Last Frontiers. This webinar is on the origins of dinosaurs and is given by Professor Paul Barrett, who is the senior dinosaur specialist at the Natural History Museum. His talk is introduced by Claire Baxter from Cambridge's Alumni Department.
Right, as the last lot come in, I shall just wish everybody a good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome you to our September armchair travel event about the origins of dinosaurs in Argentina. Please make sure that you mute yourself upon entry. Some of you will recognise me. I'm Claire Baxter, the Alumni Engagement Coordinator, who's responsible for the running of the travel programme here in Cambridge. This afternoon's event is hosted by Last Frontiers, our Latin American tour operator, and we're delighted to welcome Professor Paul Barrett, Cambridge alumnus and lecturer at the National History Museum in London. Just to remind you all of our armchair travel events are recorded, including this afternoon's. And if you've missed any of the 9 events we've previously held, these can be found on both the Oxford and Cambridge alumni websites under the events section. I'd now like to hand over to Ed Payne from Last Frontiers.
Thank you very much, Claire, and I will try and be similarly brief so we can get to the main event. But for those of you who don't know me, my name's Ed Payne, as it should say on the screen in front of you, and I've been running specialist tour operator Last Frontiers. We deal just with Latin America for the last 30 years or so. And for the last 4 years, we've been involved in group tours for Oxford and Cambridge, which I must say has been great fun. I'm just going to quickly show you which ones we've got coming up in a minute. But first of all, I just was going to say we do a rather lovely guidebook, I call it, rather than a brochure. And if any of those of you watching today would like one, please just send me an email, as it says below, and I'll put a link in the chat later. We have in 2022, UK government permitting, and I'm sure they will by then, 3 tours that we're running with Oxford and Cambridge. The first one is in May, and it's with Nick Davies, who's from Cambridge. I don't know, some of you might have read his marvellous book on cuckoos. That's to Peru. That's going to be very jungly, and it should be fascinating. And he actually is giving a talk at Cambridge next week, I think, Claire, and has already given one of these talks. So do go onto the Cambridge website and have a look at that. And then we've got the dinosaur trip, which I'll tell you a little bit about in just a second. And then we've got in November an astronomy and wine trip, also to Argentina, with Professor Roger Davies from Oxford, Professor of Astrophysics there, which is another one I'm very much looking forward to. And Roger also has given a talk to the alumni. I must say it was about black holes. I had to watch it twice. Now, Paul's trip. We're so lucky to have Paul with us today, and I'll introduce you properly in a minute, but he's been to Argentina many times in search of fossils and dinosaurs, and on his trip in October, we're basically focusing on 2 main areas of the country. One of them is this, which is the northwest near San Juan province. Ischigualasto is how you pronounce the name of this provincial park, and there's a really nice museum in San Juan where the other picture was taken. And then we're going to be going to Trelew, which is on the Atlantic coast. In fact, we'll be staying at a hotel overlooking the Valdez Peninsula, where the larger photograph was taken. And if we're lucky, at that time of year, we might see some of the largest mammals in the form of the southern right whales, which should be there then, and you can usually just see them from the shore. And we also might see the guy bottom left on your screen, Diego Pol, who is a colleague of Paul's and is in that photograph at the very good MEF Museum in Trelew. We probably won't see the Patago Titan, that fiberglass model with a couple of small figures for scale. But anyway, I'm very much looking forward to it. And as Paul is, and if anyone would like more information, just let me know afterwards. Now, I think, without further ado, I'll welcome you, Paul. We're incredibly grateful to you for talking to us today. Paul is the Natural History Museum's senior dinosaur specialist, and his specialities are the biology of plant-eating dinosaurs and also large-scale evolutionary processes. As I said, he's been to Argentina, and I think above all, he's a really enthusiastic science communicator. Some of you might have seen him on television recently, and I know he crops up on the museum's YouTube channels. And as we go on, all I was going to say is please do use the chat to put any questions. I've had some questions in advance, which I'll put to Paul afterwards. But if you've got any during the event, please do add them. We might be slightly overwhelmed, but there are only 400 of you here at the moment, so I'm sure we'll manage. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to you, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Just bear with me a second while I get my screen up and running from my end. So nice to see so many people here today, and thank you very much for coming to join us this afternoon. And the topic I'm going to talk about is one that has only really been thought about seriously in the last 10 or 20 years by paleontologists around the world. And that is talking about the origin of dinosaurs. Where do they actually come from? How did this great group arise? And when we think about dinosaurs, we tend to think about scenes like this. We think about gigantic animals, huge sauropod dinosaurs like Diplodocus, these enormous multi-tonned herbivores being pursued by voracious, huge carnivores across the landscape, animals thumping their way across and really in charge of the world for a very long time. And dinosaurs were in charge for a very long time, at least on land. These were land-living animals, and they were the most common, most speciose and abundant animals for a lot of the Mesozoic era. So the Jurassic era, the Cretaceous era, anywhere you went on land, dinosaurs would be the most conspicuous animals, among the most common, and also carrying most of, if you like, the biomass in those ecosystems. Most of the meat is locked up in the dinosaurs at this time. But this wasn't always the case. Dinosaurs had to come from somewhere, and in their evolutionary journey, they actually started off as a very rare and inconspicuous, unusual group of reptiles. And the way in which they first appear on Earth start to increase in abundance and diversify into different types, and then actually get to that point where suddenly they take over, has been something that's eluded us for quite a long time. But new finds, particularly from southern South America and from East Africa, are actually now starting to illuminate that picture and fill in a lot of the missing gaps in that story. But it's very much a changing story all the time, with literally new discoveries coming out year on year that are rewriting and overwriting what we already knew. So the picture that we have of dinosaur origins now in 2021 is remarkably different from that even 20 years ago, simply as more of my colleagues have started to focus in on this area. My interest here comes around from working on this question now for about 10 or 15 years. I have a fairly healthy research program in Southern Africa. I've also been working with my colleagues in Argentina and other parts of the world to try and piece together what these early dinosaurs were like, what their ecology was like, how they were related to each other, and trying to tie in some of those things with the changes that were going on around the world in general, the environmental changes, the changes in the plants and so on. So without further ado, let's go back to a time without dinosaurs. So if we step back in time, we're now back in a period of Earth history called the Triassic Period, and we're going to the middle of the Triassic Period, which is about 240 million years ago. At this time, the world looks very, very different from how it looks today. All of the continents are joined together into a single landmass that we call Pangaea. And in theory, it would have been possible to walk all of the way from Australia to the North Pole without getting your feet wet. no major seas, no major seaways in the way. The climate was quite different from today because the land was all concentrated in one lump. The edges of that big continent were not too bad to live on. The climate was probably quite seasonal, but the interiors of these continents could be very hot, very dry areas of desert, huge areas that were fairly uninhabitable. So although in theory you could have walked all the way, there would have been these big barriers in the way in terms of fairly nasty desert to cross, and also other various environmental barriers like mountain ranges. But wherever you went in the Middle Triassic, in different parts of the world, you would often find scenes like this or animals like these. Now, this rather gruesome and gory scene is a reconstruction of something from about 240 million years ago, a fairly typical scene in the Middle Triassic. And most of the animals you can see in this picture, if not all of them, are actually quite close relatives of ours. These are some of the early relatives of mammals. And the animals that you can see, and hopefully the clue you'll get from that is at least some of these animals are furry. And they're furry because they're well on their way to being mammals. The large, more elephant-like animal on the floor is another mammal ancestor. But these things are very diverse at the time and actually are the dominant animals on land. We see herds of these things, they're very diverse, very abundant. So our own ancestors at this time, if you like, were in charge. These are the forerunners of the mammals. And living alongside them, we also had a number of crocodile forerunners, animals like this Mandasuchus from Africa, these large predatory proto-crocodiles. And these with our own ancestors are kind of the commonest animals that we see on land. So the ecosystems at this time are quite different. And these are the kinds of dominant herbivores and carnivores. And these are animals spanning very wide ranges of sizes, from things the size of, say, a large rat, all the way through to things the size of a small hippopotamus. So quite different from the world we're used to today, and also different from the world that followed with the dinosaurs in. But even at this time, we're starting to see a lot of experimentation among the different animals that are around at this time. And in one or two places, we start to see some things that start to offer clues as to where dinosaurs may have come from. Now, this is an animal that's a relatively obscure one, but it was actually named only 4 years ago, and I was involved in the team that named it. And this is an animal that we call Telecrace. Now, Telecrace is from Africa. It's from this crucial Middle Triassic period where we have these very different animals ruling the roost already. But when we look in detail at the skeleton of Telecrace, we see a few features about it that start to offer clues as to where dinosaurs might come from. In many ways, the skeleton of Telecrace is very crocodile-like. So, for example, this is the thigh bone of Telecrace, and it has this very characteristic S-shaped bend to it. And those kind of S-shaped bends are very common in a lot of reptile groups, in lizards and crocodiles. It's a fairly standard way of building a crocodile leg. But then when we look at other bits of the skeleton, so for example, this is one of the vertebrae, the backbones from the middle part of the neck, would have been about here in the skeleton, you can see that that vertebra actually is quite long. Now, in most crocodile-like animals, these things are actually quite short and squat, whereas in things like dinosaurs later on, they actually start to play around with their necks and elongate them in different ways. They add extra bones in. And actually, it sounds a bit odd, but dinosaur necks are one of the things that help mark them out as a group. They're kind of long and elegant. They get used for lots of different things, whereas a lot of reptiles' necks are fairly squat and not particularly exciting anatomically in lots of ways. So Telecrace, it turns out, is starting to show how you can turn an animal that looks basically like a crocodile into something that's starting to get a few features that are a bit more dinosaur-like. It's a really intriguing thing. And we actually think that Telecrace is probably an animal that's marking those very first changes from something more like a crocodile into an animal that's starting to acquire a number of dinosaur-like features. Now, whenever a paleontologist shows you a reconstruction, I'm going to give you a trade secret. It's usually because the specimen it's based on isn't very pretty. And in this particular case, Telecrace is something we know about from 2 or 3 quite good specimens and lots of bits and pieces. But we've been able to pull those together to come up with a life reconstruction of what it looked like. And as you can see, it looks a little bit like a kind of very athletic kind of crocodile, or maybe even an athletic kind of monitor lizard, something like that. But it's still inherently a very obvious reptile-like animal. It walks on all fours. It would have been a carnivore from what we can tell from its teeth and so on, but a fairly standard looking reptile until you get into those esoteric details of its anatomy. But those details are important because it's by looking at those kinds of details that we work out how different animals are related to each other, by seeing the features that they all share and the common ancestry that we find exhibited through tracing those features back through time. So what actually is a dinosaur? So dinosaurs are a specific group of reptiles. They lived between about 240 million years ago and now, because birds are actually part of the dinosaur group. They are the direct living descendants of dinosaurs and the only dinosaurs that survive to this day. But dinosaurs, often when we think of them, we think of these giant animals. They're very famous because of their size. But actually what defines them most easily is all in the legs. These are one of my former PhD supervisor, Dave Norman at Cambridge, always used to try and shock his naive undergraduate audiences by saying dinosaurs are the only reptiles with sexy legs. And what he meant by that is that they have these very long hind legs. And in particular, the legs are arranged so that they form pillars tucked under the body. So if I was giving this talk in person, this is roughly the point of the talk at which I would be doing various inelegant impressions of sumo wrestlers to show basically how crocodiles and lizards hold their bodies up with their legs held out to the sides, with their bellies dragging along the floor, and this very actually quite inefficient arrangement of trying to suspend their body between two beams held out to the side. What dinosaurs do, and actually what we did millions of years later completely independently of dinosaurs, was to rotate those legs under the body so they act as pillars in an arrangement that's very mechanically efficient at supporting weight and also at having really nice long pendulum-like strides. Crocodiles and lizards waste an awful lot of their energy and time by swinging their bodies from side to side to move their legs around, whereas this pendulum-like arrangement that we have and that dinosaurs have is actually a much more efficient way of moving. And the modifications to the legs and to the hips and to the pelvis that dinosaurs underwent are the features that define them as a group. There are a couple of other features as well that are a bit more esoteric, to do with various skull bones and things to do with their vertebrae. But the obvious things are that dinosaurs have these pillar-like legs tucked under the body in what we call a pillar-like stance. So when we're looking for animals that are near to the origin of dinosaurs, we're looking for features that start to presage these kinds of features that we see in all of the later dinosaurs. Are they modifying their legs? Are they modifying their hips? Are they modifying the way they work? And again, one of the more surprising things about dinosaurs, perhaps, is that dinosaurs start their evolutionary journey, all of them, as two-legged reptiles. They walk on their hind legs only, releasing their forelimbs for other functions. Later on in their history, they go down onto all fours, which is something we'll come back to. But to start with, they start off with this very unusual adaptation of being bipedal. And bipedality is something we see only really in dinosaurs and their descendants of birds, which are also obviously bipeds as they use their arms for flight, and also us as very good bipeds, and one or two rare experiments on the tree of life, things like kangaroos, a few lizards, one or two other mammal groups like pangolins. But it's a very unusual thing to do. The natural state for a vertebrate living on land is to walk on all fours. And for us to have all gone up on our hind legs only suggests something unusual is going on. And we don't know why they did this. We just know they did do it and they became very good at it. The why is something we're still struggling to understand. Anyway, so now we know what we're looking for. What we're looking for is a reptile that's starting to modify its hind legs and its hips and giving us clues as to where these dinosaurs might come from. And the first ones we knew about were these very inconspicuous little animals that are known largely from Patagonia, but now due to new finds also known from Western North America and from Madagascar. And these are animals called Lagopatids, and they have the rather purgative nickname of Bunnycrocks, because they thought to be quite closely related to crocodiles when they were first found, and because they have these very long, elegant hind limbs. And it was thought initially that these things were little hoppers, and they were basically hopping around. These are tiny animals. These are reptiles that are only about 25 to 30 centimeters long from the tip of the nose to the base of the tail. So these are very small and very inconspicuous. They were also very rare. When we count up the fossils from the middle Triassic rock formations that these animals are found in, they're numerically dominated by animals that belong to our own group, our own ancestry, and to these croc ancestors, whereas only a handful of fossils of these animals have been found. So not only would they have been inconspicuous because of their size, but they were also very rare ecologically. They seemed not to have been very common or very successful at the time. But nevertheless, they were there. And when we look in detail at what we know of their skeletons, we start to see a number of the features that we find in later dinosaurs, which suggest that these are early dinosaur relatives, dinosaur cousins, if you like, that are starting to modify the structures of their hind limbs, and they're becoming much more upright. They're starting to modify their hips so they're much more firmly connected to the rest of the backbone to allow them to bear the weight through those hind limbs and to transport all the force from their hind limbs to the rest of the body. So these are animals that are showing us the building blocks of dinosaurs and how we can take that crocodile-like plan we saw already in Telecrace and modify it further by reducing the reliance on your forelimbs for locomotion, instead maybe releasing them to use for manipulation of other things in the environment, whether that's prey or whether it's other individuals or predators, but relying instead on this kind of hind limb driven locomotion. This speedy kind of, these are animals that are going to be much more efficient at getting around and potentially faster than those four-legged animals that they're living alongside. And so again, these are animals that were first discovered in about the 1950s, 1960s. For a long time, only one or two specimens were known, but the last 10 years has witnessed the recovery of the first complete specimens of these animals, which is really starting to fill in some of the ways in which we start to take these building blocks of dinosaurs and assemble them. So the timing of the first true dinosaur, the first dinosaur that has all the features that we see in later members of the group, is still somewhat controversial. All of my colleagues would agree that by 235 million years ago, we have the first definitive dinosaurs. And those animals, as we'll talk about in a moment, are mainly known from Patagonia and Brazil and largely in South America with one or two exceptions. But this is an animal, and I mainly mention it because this is work I've done and I'm allowed to self-advertise one of my own pet ideas while I'm here. This is an animal called Niasasaurus, which is from Tanzania. It's known from a single specimen. And this is what we think roughly Niasasaurus would look like. And I say roughly as you're about to see what it actually looks like in the next slides. This is an animal that we think was a biped. It has a large number of features in its very partially preserved remains that we only see in dinosaurs. Niasasaurus, we argue about whether it's actually a dinosaur or whether it might be the closest known relative of dinosaurs just outside the group. And this is known as said from a single specimen, again, underscoring just how inconspicuous and unimportant dinosaurs are at their origin. They don't start off in a huge bang, but with a whimper, basically creeping into these early ecosystems. And this is some of the material of that Niasasaurus material. So what we're looking at here is an upper arm bone, what's called a humerus, unbelievably unspectacular looking specimen. This is a big flap on the edge of the humerus. It has a technical name. It's called the deltopectoral crest, which supports some of the large chest muscles, showing that this animal actually had quite beefy forearms. But the key thing about Niasasaurus that shows that it's a dinosaur, apart from that feature, these big crests are a feature of dinosaurs, is it had the remains of at least 3 specialized backbones, which are these ones down at the bottom with a drawing of them, which link the hips to the backbone. In all other reptile groups, other than dinosaurs, 2 specialized vertebrae link the hips with the backbone. In dinosaurs and their descendants, including birds, there are a minimum of 3, often many more. And this animal had at least 3 of those specialist vertebrae linking its hips into it. So again, this is pretty good evidence that this is actually a dinosaur, even if a very primitive one. And this, if it is a dinosaur, dates the origin of true dinosaurs to about 240 million years ago. This is still a contentious idea, but it is an animal that is definitely telling us something about dinosaur origins, although we're not quite sure if it's a real dinosaur yet or if it's just on the cusp of becoming one. And as I'm sure many of you appreciate, we're scientists, we like precise definitions, and hence the debate over where we draw that line. Where is the line between real dinosaur and close dinosaur relative? But Niasasaurus aside, actually, this is going back to a slide that Edward showed you earlier. This is another view of the Valley of the Moon Alastair in Argentina, up in the north west corner of the country. This is probably the key place that's been studied to illuminate dinosaur origins thus far. These sediments go back to about 235 million years ago and span through about 20 million years of the later part of the Triassic period. And these rocks have yielded so far the best remains of the earliest definitive dinosaurs that all of us agree are clearly dinosaurs and are definitely members of this amazing group. And so it's a real privilege to be able to go here, actually, because this has literally been writing the textbook so far on where dinosaurs come from and how they start to emerge from this plexus of other kind of similar reptiles that are lurking around but not making a huge impression on their ecosystems just yet. And this is kind of artist reconstruction of some of the animals that are already known from the Alastair area and from these very early rocks. And you can get a snapshot of this, of seeing again, we still have lots of crocodile-like animals. We have lots of these elephantine or hippo-like members of our own group, these early synapsids. There's a dinosaur in this reconstruction front and center, but I suspect that's because it was commissioned by a dinosaur specialist. But they're in these ecosystems, we actually have very few dinosaurs still. They're still numerically by far the rarest big group of animals that are going around, but they're there. We now know they're here, so we can put a pin in the map and a pin on the geological column and say this is where the first dinosaurs come from. Perhaps the most impressive of these early dinosaurs from Alastair is this animal here, which was also one of the first ones to be named back in the 1950s. This is an animal called Eoraptoridae Alastaensis, named obviously after the Valley of the Moon, and also after the Herrera family, and it was one of the Herrera family that discovered this rather imposing skull of a meat-eating dinosaur. And you can tell it's a meat-eater from these very deeply curved and finely serrated teeth, ideal for slicing through meat. And this skull, I'm sorry there's not a scale bar on it, but it's about 25 centimeters long. So this is also one of the larger dinosaurs, it turns out, from these very early deposits. Dinosaurs start off small, rather counterintuitively, whereas Herrerasaurus is the biggest one around at the time and actually gets up to about 2 or 3 meters in length, including the tail, which is a fairly substantial size for any kind of animal. It's small by the standards of later dinosaurs, but it was almost certainly one of the most important, or largest at least, predators in its ecosystem, and predating in a very different way. All of the other large predators around at this time are essentially big, four-legged, tank-like crocodile kind of animals. So already starting to set the scene for what we might be used to a few million years in the future when we see things like Allosaurus rampaging around in the Jurassic. So we have meat-eating dinosaurs, and in the same rocks we also have this animal. This animal is much, much smaller. Again, this is a skull about 15 centimeters long from an animal with a body length of about 1.5 meters, and this is a thing called Eoraptor. Eoraptor has been argued about a lot. Some people have suggested it's an early meat eater, but most people now think it's a very early member of a large group of plant-eating dinosaurs that we'll talk about more in the future. And this is an animal that's probably an omnivore, that, if you like, in the transition between being a meat eater and being a plant eater. It has very mixed tooth shapes with some flatter, wider teeth at the back that are more like those of plant eaters and more obviously meat-eating like teeth at the front. So possibly a more mixed diet. And again, this animal looks, again, is a biped, looks a lot like the kind of general body plan we've already seen for Herrerasaurus with those grasping limbs at the front. There's a lot of experimentation around this theme to start with. All of the major groups of dinosaurs start off as small bipeds. They all start off as either meat eaters or omnivores. And it's later in their evolutionary history, they tend to occupy these other niches. So these are what these early dinosaurs look like. They're rare, they're not very many of them. But 10 million years or so later, fast forwarding, we see the same groups elaborating on those early designs, trying to experiment with how their skulls work, how their teeth work, and also with body size. So this, for example, is in the museum in San Juan. It's a very nice replica of an animal that was named only about 5 years ago called Ingenia. And this is one of the first truly gigantic animals on Earth. This is an animal that's starting to weigh many tons. Up until now, we've been dealing with dinosaurs that didn't get any bigger than a few 100 kilograms at best, most of them much smaller than that. But Ingenia is one of those first animals that seems to have cracked the problem of large size. and increased in size and started to become a bit more obviously different from that basic dinosaur plan of being a biped. You can tell already, some of you, I'm sure, that this is an animal that's on its way to being more like something like Diplodocus. This is an early relative of things like Diplodocus and Camarasaurus from later on. You can see the size is part of that, but those of you that are dinosaur aficionados will also spot differences in things like the proportions of the skull and the length of the neck, and they're getting towards those kinds of Diplodocus-like proportions. So during the Triassic, there's still a lot of experimentation going on. We're seeing various new different types of dinosaurs play around with this basic body plan, some getting larger, different diets, and basically they're doing okay. They're not taking over. They're becoming more common. They're becoming more abundant. Some parts of the world, they're more abundant than others. For example, in North America, dinosaurs are very rare, largely through the late Triassic, whereas in South America, they seem to become more common early on. So it's not, they have not yet spread everywhere around the world. We know they're kind of there, but in most places, they don't seem to have yet become the dominant animals. That all changes, however, at the end of the Triassic, when we see a major mass extinction event, the second or third most important of these events through Earth history to hit life, which knocks out something like 2/3 of the animals and plants that are around at the time. And on land, about 50% of all of the different kinds of animal actually become extinct and get wiped out, with many groups disappearing. This extinction is now thought to be caused by a major geological event. So what's called the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or the CAMP. And the CAMP is basically associated with the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean and the beginning of the end of the supercontinent of Pangaea. This is caused by huge amounts of flood volcanism, pushing North America and Africa and Europe apart. And with the associated environmental changes because of the gases entering the atmosphere, the changes to ocean atmospheric circulation patterns that would result, this seems to have had a major effect on the animals and plants living at the time. And some of those animals and plants simply became extinct, but others were able to use that as an opportunity to spread out around the world and to empty some of the, and to fill rather, some of the empty ecological space that had been left behind by those extinctions. So for example, many of those crocodile ancestral groups were wiped out. Many of the groups of ancestors of our own mammal group were also wiped out, leaving lots of vacant ecological niches for large carnivores, small herbivores that actually, if you like, were vacuums waiting to be filled. And after that point, for reasons, again, we're still working on and we don't understand, dinosaurs seem to have prospered. They seem to have got through this extinction relatively unscathed. Some types certainly went extinct, but the major groups went through, and after that started diversifying into a larger number of types, and also started taking over in terms of numerical dominance on land. So we're now getting very used to seeing many different types of dinosaur, experimentations with new dinosaur groups appearing, new types of ways of life being invaded, and also just in terms of numbers. So we're starting to see herds and huge groups of these things around. So this is one of the dinosaurs, again from San Juan, but from later in time. This is from the early Jurassic period now, after the extinctions, about 200 million years ago. And these are very common animals in the landscape, known from many different specimens, and seem to have been, if you like, the kinds of herd animals that you would have seen around at that time. We'd be used to seeing scenes like this as we were going through, based on rather beautiful material that hopefully we'll be lucky enough we'll get to see when we go to San Juan next year. But yes, so these are animals that are starting now to be a much more conspicuous part of their environment. We also see, as I said, the invention of some new dinosaur groups. So we had a bunch of meat-eating dinosaurs already in the Triassic, but we see new and different types of those meat-eaters now appearing worldwide in the Triassic period. And again, this sets up a huge amount of later evolution in the group in terms of playing around with body size evolution and specific diets. And ultimately, this is the group, obviously, that eventually gives rise to birds some way down the line. We also get the first evidence of one of the really major groups of dinosaurs that we don't see before the end of the Triassic, and that is the Birdhip dinosaur. So the group that includes things like Stegosaurus and Triceratops has its earliest known fossil record just after the extinction event. And again, although we tend to think of this group as being dominated by big four-legged tank-like herbivores, actually the earliest members of this group were all bipeds and were probably omnivores, a bit like all the other early dinosaurs that we've already been talking about. But this is one of the other big events that happens at this time, because this is a group that goes on to be incredibly important later on, and by far the numerically dominant type of dinosaur during the Cretaceous period, giving rise to things like the duckbills, among other things, where we have massive herds of these animals trampling through the landscape. So all of this basically sets us up in the early part of the Jurassic period with a series of animals with huge potential for looking at these different ecological niches, finding different ways of life, and also evolving against a background of huge environmental change. So although we have an extinction out of the way, Pangaea continues to split up during the remainder of the Mesozoic era, as the continents slowly and inexorably move towards the positions that we're more familiar with today. As they do that, new seas open, seas repeatedly invade the land surface and retreat again, creating huge islands, creating shallow seas between them, a mosaic of landscapes, and also against a background of plant evolution. We see the disappearance of a number of archaic Triassic things like seed ferns and tree ferns to be replaced by conifers, first of all, and later by flowering plants. And against this changing background of plants and climate and geography, dinosaurs are themselves evolving to keep up with those opportunities and also to exploit new opportunities as they arrive. And they're able to do that because they have a number of inherent features that seem to have been good for, if you like, pre-adapting them to invade some of those niches. One of them is relying, for example, on that bipedal body plan. Some of these animals became very swift runners. Some of them adapted that body plan to become huge, large predators. And actually all meat-eating dinosaurs retain that two-legged stance. None of them really went down onto all fours. So it's a very successful body plan for these very large carnivores. But a number of other dinosaurs went down onto all fours. So the large, long-necked dinosaurs, the sauropods, got huger and huger and huger, and went down onto all fours, probably so that their bodies could contain huge fermentation tanks for the plant food that they would need, and also to help support that gigantic weight as they went along. And within the Birdhip dinosaurs, the group that includes Stegosaurus, Triceratops, and so on, we see the animals in that group going down onto all fours on at least 3, possibly more, independent occasions. So having gone through this evolutionary bottleneck of becoming a biped, some dinosaurs eventually give up on that and actually go back to walking on all fours secondarily. And again, we have very little idea why they should have done that. It's really hard to become a biped, and they were very, very good at it. And then for some reason, they give it up to walk back on all fours. And that's still an active area of research, why some of them should do that. All dinosaurs also grew really quickly. And this is a microscopic section through a dinosaur bone to show the bone tissues themselves. And all of the kind of little round circles you can see are the areas where the bone cells of the animal would have been while the animal was alive. And you might also be able to see that there are bands, growth bands through this bone, which represent annual cycles of where the bone was being deposited. And when we look at the thicknesses of those growth lines in lots of different dinosaurs and the texture of the bone, we can see that all dinosaurs were rapid growers, much faster than any living reptiles or most extinct ones, and actually approaching the kinds of growth rates that we see in living mammals and birds. So they were able to grow fast, and this is one of the things that allowed them to get to such large body sizes in some cases, and in other cases just meant they went through a lot of generations. These are not animals that are living to extreme old ages. Although they look huge, the largest dinosaurs only lived to be about 40 or 50 years old. They weren't slow-growing crocodile or turtle-like animals, but these were animals that were living fast and dying young in a very kind of Rolling Stones type way. So these were sort of the rock star animals of their age. And we have a huge variation in size, from animals the size of Microraptor, which is about the size of a magpie. And actually, if we think about living birds, which are part of the dinosaur radiation, we're also then talking about animals that are down to 2 grams in weight in terms of the bee hummingbird, which is the smallest dinosaur that we know about at the moment. all the way through to true giants like Argentinosaurus. And this is me for scale. So this is the ankle of well, actually the wrist of Argentinosaurus, and that's me just for scale. So I'm about as long as the forearm of an Argentinosaurus. And these are animals that are thought to have weighed up to about 60 or 70 metric tons. So we're talking animals that weigh about the same as about 10 bull African elephants, which would have required a huge amount of fuel and probably made lots of very deep rumbling stomach noises as they were walking around the landscape. Talking of which, dietary plasticity is also something that these animals were really keen on. Some of them remained as carnivores, retaining essentially their primitive origins. Some of them becoming very sophisticated carnivores with all sorts of mechanisms for catching their prey, pack hunting and things like that. Also, animals that ate fish, things that specialized on everything from insects to the other giant dinosaurs around them. While the plant-eating dinosaurs themselves, and these are three engineering models of three different plant-eating dinosaur skulls showing how they stress and strain during feeding, were also experimenting. Some of these things were simply nipping vegetation off. Others of them were expert grinders and were effectively the cows and sheep of the Mesozoic, really exploiting all of the varied plants that were around them. And they also were experimenting in other aspects of their physiology. In addition to growing fast, we know that many dinosaurs were feathered. And the feathers seem to be a very strong part of the meat-eating dinosaur story. It looks like an awful lot of the meat eaters would have been covered in a pelage of really quite spectacular feathers in some cases, although many other dinosaurs retain that primitive reptilian scaly skin, in particular the plant eaters. And this goes along with a number of behavioral changes as well. We can infer things like behavior through display, for example. So there are a number of more sophisticated behaviors that as mammals we tend to think arouse alone, but actually dinosaurs were doing many of these things too. And all of these things in combination meant they could occupy an exceptionally wide breadth of different ecological niches, which accounts for their success through 140 million years of the Jurassic and Cretaceous and their worldwide spread. Dinosaurs are literally known from Antarctica to the North Slope of Alaska and from California to Japan. These are animals that achieved a worldwide distribution, lived in environments from coastal plains to hot deserts, and were clearly unbelievably successful. And as I mentioned already, are also still with us today because the meat eaters also gave rise to birds sometime around 145 million years ago. But unfortunately, from my point of view, because I don't work on birds so much, all the dinosaurs that I think are particularly interesting eventually succumbed to another catastrophe, the end Cretaceous mass extinction event that happened about 66 million years ago. And that after a lot of work, we are now convinced is due to a 10-kilometer wide asteroid striking the Earth in what's now the Yucatan region of the Gulf of Mexico. And at that point, snuffing out all of these really exciting and sometimes unparalleled animals from history, but leaving us with their legacy in the shape of the robins and the blue tits that you might see in your garden. Anyway, thank you very much.
Paul, thank you very much indeed for an absolutely fascinating presentation, which has left, I think, more questions with me. I'm certainly looking forward to sharing a trip to Argentina with you. We have got a few questions if you've got time. I'll try and be as succinct and quick as I can. The first one I was going to ask you was from Bembrook Yates. He says, how easy is it to determine the colour of the dinosaurs?
This is kind of an embarrassing question. When I was asked this question, say 5 or 6 years ago, my answer would be, we will never know the colour of a dinosaur ever. It's just stupid. We won't know. But now we have got ways of finding colours of dinosaurs. Not in many cases, unfortunately, because most of the pigments and things like that that give us colour in skin and feathers degrade over time or just disappear during fossilization. But there are a few very unusual fossil sites around the world where the preservation of the fossils is so good now, we can actually get clues as to the original color patterning, because we often get organic films of the original material preserved around those skeletons, which give an idea of which areas were dark and light. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you can do some very sophisticated geochemical analyses and microscopical analyses that actually show you the component parts of the cells that contain the original pigment. And colleagues of mine have actually shown that if you can get the shape of those original cellular structures, you can make some good predictions about what the original color was. And that technique in particular is quite good for working out colors like blacks and browns and russets, so fairly dull colors. But I don't think it will be long before people have cracked how we might find some of the shinier colors like blues and greens, which are also produced by kind of physical mechanisms within the skin and feathers by little diffraction gratings. And eventually, I think we'll probably find one or two fossils that are so well preserved, we might even get some of those.
Thanks. And slightly related, I guess, they're different. Carol Thompson asked us, what is the latest thinking on the sounds that the dinosaurs would have made?
Also a really good question, because we have to reverse engineer those kinds of questions, because the soft tissues of the throat that are largely responsible for making noises, and also of the nose, which kind of acts as a little resonating chamber, all decay. So we have to make a few guesses. So first of all, we just look at the general kind of shape in the skull of what would be left behind in the nose and the throat. We look a little bit at, say, the shape of the throat bones, which are sometimes preserved, to give us an idea about that too. And also we look at living animals that are closely related to dinosaurs, so birds and crocodiles, and get an idea of the range that's available. Crocodiles are actually quite vocal in some ways, so that gives us some constraints. But perhaps the most interesting way of doing it is actually looking at dinosaur ears, because the inner part of the ear that actually contains the organ of hearing is surrounded by bone. So inner ears of dinosaurs actually fossilize within the skull, and we can use CT scanning to extract those little bits of the inner ear, the semicircular canals and the inner ear that's attached to it. And by just taking a few measurements of those and comparing them with living animals, we can come up with some predictions about how the animals heard. And then we can extrapolate, if the animal's hearing that sound, it's quite likely it might have been making it, or at least it's behaviour important for it in some way. So that's one way of reverse engineering the problem, of basically working out how good dinosaur hearing was, and then suggesting that the sounds that are of importance to it are within that range. So we've got a couple of ways of doing it, but unfortunately no surefire infallible way of knowing whether T-Rex warbled like a finch or whether it roared like a crocodile.
I'm sure the filmmakers make their choices. Here's a question from Charlotte Green, who's asked you quite a few. Charlotte, you've asked quite a few questions. I don't think I've got time for them all. I'm going to pick one out. She says, given that the chicken and turkey have both been recorded as capable of doing parthenogenesis, and I think, Paul, you might have to explain to me what that is, do you think it likely that some dinosaurs could do this too?
So parthenogenesis is basically reproduction without sex. So some populations, it's particularly well known in things like some insects, like ladybirds, for example, that the females are able to lay kind of fertilized eggs that develop into fully grown adults that can go away and do their own thing. And it's been recorded once or twice in some birds, and also actually Komodo dragons fairly recently. So they're like in the media, they'd be called virgin births, basically. And so it's possible that dinosaurs did this from time to time, because we know that some other vertebrates did it. But in all of those groups alive, things like birds and lizards and so on, it doesn't look like it's a particularly important reproductive thing for me. It looks more like something that just happens occasionally, possibly in very, very specific environmental unusual circumstances. So I think it's a reasonable guess they might have done it, but I'm not sure how important it would have been to them during their evolution.
Okay, I'm going to ask you two questions in one now, because I think they're a bit related. Roger, earlier in the chat, Roger Thomas asked, when you were talking about dinosaurs walking on two legs, how did they maintain balance? Did it require a complex neurological system? And then Robert Cashmore asked earlier, he says, if dinosaurs evolved to such a great extent and ruled the world for so many million years, why haven't they re-evolved during the past 80 million years?
Okay, so taking that in a couple of bits, the bipedal thing, when we look at where the body mass was in a dinosaur, we know that its center of mass was basically between the hind legs in those bipedal dinosaurs. So it's nice and stable. It's got, it's basically supporting its way around that point of the body, which makes it as stable as it possibly can be. And that center of mass doesn't move out of that while the animal's walking. And in terms of the wiring necessary, the brains of these animals are exactly the size you'd expect for animals of those body sizes. So they must have had the wiring that enabled them to do that too. I mean, everything about their skeletons suggests that these are set up to be on their hind legs and that they're relatively stable when they're in that kind of pose. I think one of the reasons maybe for that question is dinosaurs are often pegged as being quite dumb, as having quite small brains and maybe not being up to doing some of the things that we might otherwise expect them to do. But the kind of counterpoint to that is actually an animal's brain is largely just related to the size of its body. We're slightly unusual in that we have, well, we're very unusual actually in having brains that are much larger than they should be for our body size. Because really we should only have a brain about the same size as, say, a leopard or something, rather than the brain that we do have. So it's animals that depart from that relationship and have either brains that are way too small for their bodies or way too big for their bodies that are the kind of the interesting ones. But most animals just actually have as much brain as they need. They basically just need to know how to make other animals not get eaten by other animals and find things to eat. And they're doing quite well if they do those three things. Right. And so going on to the second part of that question, to do with why didn't dinosaurs re-evolve? Well, dinosaurs have still been with us. So we've had birds all the way through, and birds have been showing again how the dinosaur body plan was adapted in a different way, in that they took their forelimbs and turned them into aerodynamic structures so that they could fly, and also did a number of other things that many other extinct dinosaurs didn't do in terms of things like diets and where they live in the world. And so, for example, there was nothing like the equivalent of a Jurassic dinosaur penguin. So dinosaurs are still evolving now in slightly different ways. It's just that the ways that we're more familiar with from the extinct dinosaurs were unfortunately cut off by that giant rock from outer space.
And just one more on the topic of intelligence. Is there any evidence for collaborative work in hunting or defending?
There's a little bit of evidence, but it's tangential. So some of the meat-eating dinosaurs do have slightly larger brains than we'd expect for their body size. And that suggests that they might have been smarter than the average dinosaur. To paraphrase Yogi Bear, actually, thinking about it, just smarter than the average dinosaur. But the other thing that we do have are a couple of kill sites of some large plant-eating dinosaurs where there's evidence from the teeth that break off during these attacks of several different sized animals attacking at once. But that evidence is a little bit more difficult to interpret because it could be that that same large herbivore was eaten by different carnivores at slightly different times before it turned into a fossil. A good bit of evidence would be actually finding lots of tracks of a meat eater converging on the tracks of a plant eater, and there are meant to be a couple of examples of that too. So there's some evidence of that, but it's by no means overwhelming.
Fascinating, and I think I'll finish off with a question. You're lucky, like me, in that you do a job that you love, that takes you to bits of the world you love. I've been asked here, and I think there was a similar question in the chat. How does the South American dinosaur evolution relate to finds in China?
So dinosaurs lived all around the world, and we often find close relationships between different dinosaurs, even in quite widely spaced areas. So both China and Argentina actually have very good records of dinosaurs stretching for almost the entire range of when they were alive. So they actually have, if you like, that in common in terms of the continuity of our knowledge through those periods. They're both countries with huge amounts of badlands that we can explore for these kinds of things. And the one big difference between the two at the moment is that so far we haven't found any of the really special deposits in Argentina that give us things like the feathers that we know should be on some of these dinosaurs. Whereas China seems blessed with a couple of these very special windows because of specific geological circumstances that have given us that information. But I'm sure with enough exploration, I'm sure they'll eventually turn up in Argentina, because it's a vast country with lots of places to explore. But yeah, the two things actually, they're quite similar. They're both powerhouses for finding new dinosaurs at the moment, both with very good local communities of paleontologists working on them. But some of the dinosaurs found in each place are a bit different. Those found in China are generally either only found in China or a bit more similar to those found elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, whereas Argentina tells us very much a lot of the story about what we know, what's going on down south at the time. So there are some specific differences in the types of dinosaurs we find too.
Thank you, Paul. I'm aware that we've taken up a lot of your valuable time. It was absolutely fascinating presentation. I've learned an awful lot. I'm sure everyone here has. If you missed the beginning of it, we'll you watch the recording later. But from all of us, Paul, I just wondered now if anyone would be very welcome to unmute themselves and show their appreciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.